This is it. This is the one you've probably heard of, in no small part I imagine due to its recent remake. But even before Bloober Team took a swing at recreating the magic of Team Silent's original piece, if you're at all a fan of video games, especially horror games, there's a good chance you're familiar with Silent Hill 2. As a self-professed video game history nerd, Silent Hill 2 has been nigh inescapable. This could just be my bias given the circles I tend to frequent, but Silent Hill 2 feels like it's in the running for most scrutinized games in the medium. A cursory glance around YouTube or your search engine of choice is bound to elicit countless think pieces and essays covering everything from its themes, to its use of symbolism, to its place in horror games history. But, as you might expect from that funny little number at the end of its title, Silent Hill 2 didn't just come out of nowhere. Following the success, both critically and financially, of the first game, you might think Team Silent would take a victory lap, or at least a breather. It's not every day you successfully launch a new franchise after all, let alone one that can seemingly go toe-to-toe with one of the titans of horror, Resident Evil. But rest they did not. As soon as the summer of '99, the team, now without Keiichiro Toyama who left to join Sony, began pre-production on what would become Silent Hill 2. With Toyama gone, directing duties fell to Masashi Sugiyama, who was a background designer on the first game. The story this time around was primarily conceived by Takayoshi Sato, who you may remember as the man who spent the bulk of the previous game's development sleeping under his desk, with support from Hiroyuki Owaku, an underappreciated workhorse who did much of the writing for the first 3 games. Where the first title's inspirations were broad and somewhat non-specific, pulling widely from general small-town Americana, cults, and what was standard in survival horror at the time, with the groundwork now laid, the team was able to get more specific with their influences for Silent Hill 2. This meant pulling from the likes of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment for the narrative, the films of David Lynch for the atmosphere and tone, as well as Core Design's Tomb Raider series for the actual act of navigating a 3D space. The gameplay itself wasn't going to change much outside of some fine-tuning, allowing for greater emphasis on the game's themes and characters. This marked a shift for the title. While the original is kind of the poster child for psychological horror in games, that's more for how it affected the player. The plot-driven nature and rather stock characters left little room for psychological analysis of the game itself. For Silent Hill 2, this concept would now extend to the game's characters, with the plot being more reflective of each individual's psychological state. And so the team toiled away over the next 2 years until Silent Hill 2 finally launched between September and November of 2001 for the PS2. A few months later, or an entire year if you lived in Europe, it would see a mildly expanded port to Microsoft's Xbox, and finally there was a PC port a year or so after that in 2002. We wouldn't see the title again until roughly a decade later with its much maligned inclusion in the Silent Hill HD collection for PS3 and Xbox 360 in 2012. And finally there's the previously mentioned remake released in October 2024. At the time of its initial launch, Silent Hill 2 saw solid sales, selling over 1 million units and equally solid critical success, with many outlets putting it roughly on par with the first game. It was only over time that its many layers would be peeled back, dissected, and presented anew, growing its legacy to the point that it not only eclipsed pretty much every other title in its own series, but much of the horror genre itself. And oh boy, did I consume my fair share of media covering Silent Hill 2 before finally deciding to engage with the source material for this review. From hour-plus long video essays, to reviews, to memes. As I said in my previous video, I was shaky on if I would ever get around to the series, so I saw no real harm at the time in spoiling the game rotten for myself. As such, going into this I knew the broad strokes of the plot as well as a good deal of details concerning the cast. Which begs the question, does it still hold up in spite of all of that? Does the story of Silent Hill 2 stand the test of time, or is it the product of nostalgia and an echo chamber of praise that's been ringing non-stop for over 20 years? I suppose the only option is to step into James Sunderland's shoes and see for myself. But before I do, a brief visit to the Shill Corner. Y'all know I love what I do here at llamelion Gaming, and it's a dream of mine to one day make this my full-time job. Alas, to do that, I require the assistance of all of you lovely, lovely folks watching. So if you enjoyed this silly little niche I'm trying to carve out for myself here on YouTube, please consider subscribing, sharing this video around, liking, commenting, you know the drill. Every little bit helps and honestly means more to me than I could possibly put into words. With that out of the way, let's get back to the review. It all starts with a letter from a wife to her husband. In it, she talks of days gone by, of the town of Silent Hill, a place visited in their past, and a longing to see it once more. The husband had promised to take her back one day, but never did, and so she's made the decision to return on her own, awaiting his arrival in their special place. Innocent on its surface, there lies something beneath her words, things left unspoken. Why is it he never took her back? Why would she opt to return without him? And just where exactly is their special place? For now, much of these details remain obscured, but some become immediately clear when we learn that the husband, James, recently received this letter from his wife, Mary, despite her having passed away from illness 3 years prior. With nothing but her letter to go on, James must venture back to the fog-choked streets to see if it's true. Is the woman he loved truly alive? And if so, just what is she doing in Silent Hill? Along the way, he encounters other similarly lost souls, all of whom have been drawn to Silent Hill for their own reasons. There's Angela, shy and nervous, searching for her mother, Eddie, defensive and insecure, who may or may not be on the run from the police, Laura, mischievous but not unkind, who claims to have befriended Mary in the hospital, and Maria, at once flirty and cruel, who bears a striking resemblance to James's lost wife. Each member of the cast weaves in and out of James's story, existing not for his sake or to further his development. They just happen to have arrived in Silent Hill around the same time, and each must face horrors all their own, carefully tailored for them by the town. I'm gonna be honest, even in just giving this brief setup, I feel overwhelmed. Not by the scope. Silent Hill 2's narrative remains close-knit and intimate over the course of its 7.5-ish hour long runtime, rather by the sheer amount of craft on display and the impact these characters and their narratives had on me. Silent Hill 2 tackles themes that a lot of games, hell, a lot of media, tend to either shy away from or just outright mishandle. I can't get into many specifics for fear of spoiling the whole damn thing, but these topics include abuse in many of its forms, from physical to sexual to psychological, with the targets ranging from children to animals to family members. Of course, it's not just the inclusion of these themes. Many a hack writer has haphazardly included one or more of them in their own works with the sole goal of coming off as edgy or mature. Rather, it's how these themes are presented and explored, and who the focus is on. Essentially, every character in Silent Hill 2, with the exception of Laura, is in some way both a victim and a perpetrator. You don't wind up in Silent Hill without a reason, and their individual narratives center on how they react when the town forces them to confront the abuses they've suffered and the fallout their suffering has led to. It is, in a way, impassive. The game doesn't cast judgment, but rather presents nuanced portraits of characters struggling with the various traumas they faced, and it is so fucking good. One of my favorite extensions of this is the endings, where the first game's endings built on one another to what was clearly the best possible outcome given the circumstances. Here, that's not the case. There are 3 main endings you can receive on a first playthrough, and rather than being tied to the lore of the town or completion of side quests, numerous minor factors over the course of the game push James towards one ending or another, with each acting as logical endpoints to his narrative. As such, I would recommend foregoing a guide on your first run and seeing where you end up. That's how I played it, and the ending I got just felt right for my interpretation of James's character. If you end up not being a fan of your ending, or just want to see what else the game has to offer, the short runtime paired with subsequent playthroughs increasing the likelihood of achieving the endings you've yet to see makes for breezy replays if you'd rather not look the endings up online. There's also New Game Plus, which brings another 3 endings into the fold. 2 of them are joke endings, which once again are more than worth checking out for a laugh. Meanwhile, the third holds some interesting tidbits for the lore of Silent Hill itself, with implications of greater powers at work within the town. I don't yet know if anything comes from this in future games, but it provided just enough connective tissue that, despite the anthological nature of the series, it got me forming a corkboard-style web of intrigue, linking one title to another in my mind, which is exactly what I want from these kinds of stories. This is a review though, and so I do feel the need to point out some of the issues I experienced, and while there aren't many concerning the narrative, I did run into a bit of a hiccup with the pacing, particularly around 2/3 of the way in when James ventures first into Toluca Prison and subsequently the Labyrinth. While some really solid story beats happen near the end of these sections, both get a little long in the tooth and are rather uninspired in terms of their actual looks and design. The prison is, as you might expect, dingy concrete walls and jail cells. It's the less egregious of the two with some solid atmosphere and sound design, and my experience navigating it probably wasn't helped by the fact that I missed the map at first and so ended up exploring a good portion of it by memory, which, like with the final area in the first game, kinda sucks when so much of the layout and aesthetic is super samey. The Labyrinth is where things really started to get draining. The whole area is this big set of boring looking hallways with very little to break it up. The section probably isn't actually that long, but the lack of variety and dull look made it feel like it went on forever. If there was a time I would have dropped the game, it'd have been here. Thankfully, everything after this point is some of, if not the best the game has to offer. I just wish these two sections had been tightened up, or hell, they probably could have cut the labyrinth altogether and it would have been better. Thankfully, the labyrinth is the lowest point for the game in terms of graphics and aesthetic, because otherwise the team rocks their first foray on the PS2. I mean, sure, the lake in the distance in the opening scene is clearly just a PNG, and the trees are just copy and pasted models with silly little crunchy leaves, but I don't know, I find that kind of thing charming, and it's only one of a handful of times where they attempt to tackle distance, which really isn't the game's strong suit. No, its strength lies in the interiors. Look no further than when we first meet James, standing before a clouded mirror in a truly disgusting rundown bathroom. It made me feel the need to take a shower just looking at it, and that sensation carries over throughout the rest of the game, with Silent Hill feeling like a town that aged a century in a day. What should be modern and pristine storefronts, streets, and furnishings have given way to mold, mildew, and decay. It forms a distinct visual identity compared to the first game, where that was very heavy on the reds and oranges. Silent Hill 2 relies more on blues and grays, emphasizing this part of town's proximity to the lake and making everything feel as though it could give away beneath a touch. Two returning standouts are the fog and darkness. While the fog was oppressive in the first game, here it is downright suffocating. My first steps into Silent Hill proper, realizing just how little I could actually see around me, made me feel confined in an open space, which is a feeling I don't think I've felt in a game. But we need to talk about the darkness. The first major locations James visits are the Woodside and Blue Creek apartment buildings, and holy shit are they dark. But not in a way that you just can't see anything. No, they smartly provide enough visibility you can almost see what's ahead, but not enough to make you feel secure in your surroundings. This is helped by the level design, which, contrary to most video games, is scaled in a more realistic fashion. This means that hallways and apartments are cramped, with James and the creatures he faces off against taking up a good deal of real estate. Where before you might be able to run around and avoid a lot of foes, here the tightness of the play space makes confronting them an inevitability. And the foes you'll be facing down are a definite step up from what we saw in the first game. While still painfully few in number, they're much more interesting in design, from the straitjackets strictly approaching James only to scuttle around like cockroaches after taking a few hits, to the nurses who have become a Silent Hill staple, and for good reason, human enough to be both eerie and sympathetic before they let out a howl and attempt to beat James with a pipe. And then there's Pyramid Head. I wasn't expecting his introduction to consist of him randomly looming on the other side of an impassable gate in an apartment hallway, but it accomplishes so much in establishing who this figure is. Pyramid Head is persistence and unceasing punishment. It doesn't matter if he can't get to you immediately, he's in no rush. When the time comes, he will be ready, his great knife sharp, his butcher's apron thirsting for blood splatter, and his gaze hidden away behind his pyramid-shaped helmet, always watching. Back to the environments, the one major downside with the apartments has less to do with the locations themselves and more with their place in the context of the experience as a whole, which is that they are, in my estimation, the peak as far as horror in this game goes. Part of that has to do with Silent Hill 2's themes and goals. This is, after all, a character study first and foremost, and as such, many potential avenues for horror give way in service of reflecting the inner turmoil of the cast. That said, I don't mind the game not being all that terrifying. I didn't find the first game very scary either, but I will say the sense of tension that permeated much of the first title isn't as consistently present this go around as a result. That may also have to do with the sound design. Don't get me wrong, Yamaoka still brought his A game with some fantastic enemy screeches and the occasional bit of creeping ambiance, but it didn't really stick with me. I can't even recall anything that truly got under my skin on the sound front, which was definitely not the case with the first game. But where the more environmental aspects of the soundscape take a bit of a back seat, Yamaoka is on another level when it comes to the actual score. It effortlessly shifts from ethereal and dreamlike to a nightmare of respirators and machinery. It is despair and guilt made manifest. The focus here is on reflecting the emotional arcs of each character, making for a soundtrack that is much stronger thematically than the first game's efforts, if not as conducive to crafting a horror atmosphere. So listen to the soundtrack, seriously, all of it. It's fantastic in ways I do not have the vocabulary to describe. And especially listen to Theme of Laura, Reprise. It is undoubtedly my favorite song on the OST, only made more so by it accompanying one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the entire game. I can't, it's so good, you guys. Speaking of individual scenes, let's talk voice acting. I am happy to report that it is leagues better than what we got last time, which admittedly isn't hard to do, but is still nice to see. The most notable glow-up has to be James as compared to Harry. Where Harry was emotionless and wooden, Geisy lends a sense of humanity to James with a subdued performance that makes him feel almost numb, which only makes those occasions where his frustration or despair come to the fore hit that much harder.
How do you know about Mary?
What's the big deal?
Why can't you just tell me?
You gonna yell at me if I don't?
No, I won't.
I was friends with Mary. We met at the hospital. It was last year.
You liar! Laura!
The rest of the cast is of a similar level, with Donna Burke as Angela, David Schofield as Eddie, and Jacqueline Beckenridge as Laura. There are of course the occasional odd line reads or weird cadence, but this is likely due more to the direction than the actors themselves. Star for me, however, is once again a woman in red, as Monica Horgan pulls double duty as both Mary and Maria. She manages to nail both roles despite their contrasting personalities, whether that's somber and sickly, light and teasing, or erratic and biting. Maria especially stands in such stark contrast to James's dour and mute portrayal that it almost shouldn't work, but Sihi and Horgan, backed by solid writing, managed to pull it off, which is a good thing too, as their relationship is arguably the linchpin of the narrative.
I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real. Don't you want to touch me?
I don't know.
Come and get me. I can't do anything through these bars.
Okay.
Despite that narrative being what Silent Hill 2 is best known for, this is a video game after all, so there's gotta be some gameplay backing it up. By and large, what's here is an extension of what came before. You're still exploring town, gathering weapons, ammo, and health items as you make your way from one key location to another, from the aforementioned Woodside and Blue Creek apartments to Brookhaven Hospital to the Silent Hill Historical Society. These locations once again act as dungeons of sorts, pitting James against all manner of beasties while tasking him with tracking down puzzle items to solve the numerous riddles barring his path. One notable addition is separate difficulties for the action and puzzles. I played on easy for action and normal for puzzles. Health items and ammo were less plentiful than in the first game, but I still found more than enough to get me through without feeling the need to hoard. I would recommend bumping the action difficulty up if you prefer a challenge, as doing so will reduce the number of consumables as well as increase enemy numbers and their damage output. For the puzzles, I found them to be easier this go around. I never had to break out the pen and paper to take notes or seek outside assistance like I did a handful of times with the first game. While this did make for constant forward progression, I would have liked them to be a bit more challenging. I can't even recall any particular puzzles off the top of my head. Because of that, I'll definitely be increasing the puzzle difficulty for future replays. For the combat, something I found interesting was just how more immediately capable James felt to control. His animations are less stiff with quicker windups and lacking the sort of locked in feeling I had with a lot of Harry's attacks. You're not given a gun right away, having to make do with a wood plank to beat enemies over the head with for a bit, which I really liked. Both games thus far have had a viscerality to the melee that I feel fits the tone of the series better than gunplay. Between the smoother controls and lack of flying enemies, I defaulted to melee more often in Silent Hill 2 than I did in 1, even if I did still wind up heavily relying on guns as I progressed further into the game. Enemies, though, are still sadly not as varied as I would hope, numbering even less than the first game. Their designs and attack patterns are more varied, which combined with a short length managed to keep combat from growing tiresome. This was aided by my opting to avoid combat when possible, especially while out exploring the town. This was something I should have done more in the first game too. There's really no reason to fight when just traveling from place to place. The amount of ammo Silent Hill 1 showered me with activated my action game brain to that title's detriment. Now that I'm more familiar with the formula, I frequently skirted around foes, keeping combat fresh as I had less opportunity to grow weary of it. Once again, I kept the most important detail for last, that being the movement. Upon booting up Silent Hill 2, if you venture into the options menu, you'll see a little thing labeled Control Type. Default is set to 3D, which is the traditional tank control setup as popularized by Resident Evil and seen in the first game. However, swap that over to 2D and James now has full range of motion as you would expect if you've played a third-person 3D title in the last 25 years. Is it the intended way to play? Probably not. Did I run into instances where the camera would shift and I'd accidentally wind up walking back the way I came because suddenly James's forward was different than it had been moments before? Oh, most definitely. But all of that melts away in the face of having James's movement be in line with what I've come to expect from a third-person action-adventure game. It's fairly smooth, I didn't have to think about it, and combined with a refined camera, it made for an experience that is infinitely more playable and palatable to modern audiences. And of course, the tank controls are still there if you'd rather stick with them. At this point, I don't think you need me to tell you that Silent Hill 2 is a great game. I've laid out a handful of flaws, from variety to pacing to lacking horror elements, but none of that really matters. It's one of the few instances where something that has been hyped to hell and back actually managed to live up to it for me. The story, music, art direction, it all works together so well that even despite knowing so much of the plot ahead of time, it's still made for an experience that I'm constantly thinking about. So do I recommend it? What kind of question is that? Of course I do. Everyone should experience Silent Hill 2 in one way or another. Even if horror isn't really your thing, I'm convinced you'll find something to appreciate about it. Now, actually playing the game is a bit of a different story. The easiest method these days would be the recent remake. I've heard good things, but have not played it for myself, and if you can't tell, I'm a bit of a fan of context when it comes to a series, so would generally recommend checking out the original release if possible. If you do, you'll most likely have to go with either emulation or the PC version. A PS2 copy retails for around $150 USD, with Xbox at about half that. Not the worst of the games I've covered, but still pretty bad. The PC version though is abandonware and can be found pretty easily if you know where to look. If you do go that route, I check out the Silent Hill 2 Enhanced Edition mod to make it playable on modern operating systems, as well as adding a solid suite of enhancements. If you do decide to dive in, make sure not to rush through it. Take your time, bask in the mood and atmosphere, and be prepared. Silent Hill 2 is an incredible narrative experience and one of the most thoughtful examinations of trauma and the personal hells each and every one of us goes through that I've seen. And once you've experienced what it has to offer, there's no going back. God knows I wish I could, if just to do it all over again. Thank you all so much for watching and sticking around to the end. God dang, Silent Hill 2 rules. Go figure, the game everybody's been showering with praise for like 20 years is actually pretty decent. I just didn't expect it to still hit so hard given everything I knew and had heard about it going in. Anywho, as always, please take care of yourselves and each other, and next time, I think I'll be hitting the mall with my pal Heather. Can't imagine anything could possibly go wrong there.